The morning sun bathed Ouagadougou in a golden glow as President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of the presidential palace. But unlike other mornings, filled with official briefings and diplomatic formalities, this Monday carried a different weight. Today, the young leader of Burkina Faso had made a decision that would stun his security team and alter countless lives. "Drive me to the central prison," he said quietly to his driver, adjusting his simple brown shirt. "No advance notice. No press. Just us." The driver's eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror, startled. "Sir, shouldn't we alert the prison authorities? Arrange security protocols?" Traoré's reply was firm. "No, I want to see how our people really live behind those walls. No staged visits. No masks." And with that, the black presidential vehicle merged into the pulse of Ouagadougou's morning life. Only 2 discreet cars followed. Street vendors hawked their goods, children played barefoot in dusty alleys, and the city's rhythm remained unaware that its president was on quiet mission to witness the hidden fractures in their justice system. 40 minutes later, the convoy rolled to a stop before the towering gray walls of Ouagadougou's central correctional facility. Razor wire gleamed ominously atop the concrete barriers, and an eerie silence seemed to hang in the air, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The gate guards froze, their hands trembling as they recognized the presidential seal. "Mr. President," one stammered, fumbling with the keys. We weren't expecting you, sir." "That's exactly why I'm here," Traoré replied, stepping out of the car. "Open the gates." Prison warden Pascal Ouidraogo came running, beads of sweat glistening on his brow despite the morning's cool breeze. "Your Excellency had we known, we would have made arrangements. The facilities, the prisoners—" "I'm not here for arrangements," the president cut in sharply. "Take me to the prisoners." The warden hesitated, but the determination in Traoré's voice left no room for argument. He led the president through dim corridors, echoing with distant sounds, coughs, muttered conversations, the cold clang of metal doors slamming shut. Stench hit them like a wall and washed bodies, damp concrete, and the suffocating air of forgotten souls. As they entered the main cell block, an unnatural hush swept over the space. Moments ago, inmates had been scattered playing cards, sprawled on thin mattresses, lost in daydreams or despair. Now they stood, slowly, almost disbelieving. Confusion flickered across their faces, followed by a long-buried emotion: hope. President Traoré moved among them not as a ruler, towering above, but as a man genuinely curious about their stories. He shook hands, asked questions, and most importantly, listened. His security team exchanged surprised glances, unaccustomed to seeing their leader sit on cold prison floors, engaging with those the world had discarded. "How long have you been here?" he asked a middle-aged man. 3 years, Mr. President," the man replied. "Theft charges." "Do you have family? A wife and 2 children? They visit? They can afford the bus fare?" Traoré nodded thoughtfully, filing every story into his mind. Some inmates spoke boldly, others with cautious whispers. A few broke down, overwhelmed by the unexpected attention. For over an hour, the president walked through overcrowded cells, bridging a gap that had long been ignored. But it was a small, darkened cell at the far end that brought him to a halt. In its corner sat a figure who hadn't risen with the others. His head bowed, hands loosely clasped in his lap. His beard was tangled, his clothes threadbare, and his posture radiated a quiet surrender. This man hadn't just been imprisoned by walls. He had been caged by hopelessness. President Traoré approached slowly, sensing the gravity of what was unspoken. This was not just another inmate. This was a man the system had swallowed whole. Unlike the others who had rushed to see their unexpected visitor, this man remained still, his body unmoving, his spirit seemingly numb to surprises long forgotten. President Ibrahim Traoré approached slowly, his steps soft, stopping just outside the rusted iron bars of the cell. The man looked up gradually. His eyes met the president's, and in them was not defiance or fear, but a deep, haunting sadness. This was no hardened criminal. This was a man worn down by the slow erosion of injustice. "What is your name?" the president asked. his tone gentle. "Emmanuel," came the reply, so faint it was almost a breath. "How long have you been?" "Here, Emmanuel. 7 years, sir." The number didn't echo in the air. It hung there heavy, suffocating. President Traoré studied Emmanuel's face. There was no bitterness, no visible anger. Only the quiet dignity of a man who had endured alone for far too long, a man who had nothing left to give except the truth. "What were you accused of?" Traoré asked, his voice softer still. Emmanuel's throat bobbed as he swallowed, summoning courage to answer. "They said I stole money from my employer. I didn't do it, sir. I worked for that man for years. When things went wrong, he needed someone to blame, and I was. Convenient." As Emmanuel spoke, his voice gained a trembling strength, as though the simple act of being heard was awakening a part of him that had been buried under years of silence. The president listened, every word cutting deeper, every pause a reminder of how invisible some people had become. "I had no lawyer," Emmanuel continued, his tone now firmer, almost defiant. "No one to speak for me. When they brought me to court, I stood alone. My former boss sat with his expensive attorneys. The judge barely looked at me before sentencing me. 15 years.
You're on." The president's jaw tightened.
Beneath his calm exterior, a cold fury began to rise. "Tell me about your employer." Traoré said his name Laurent Gouer, Emmanuel replied. "He owns a logistics company. Worked as a clerk there for 8 years. I was honest, punctual, never missed a day. But then his nephew needed a job, and I became disposable." The betrayal in Emmanuel's words was sharp, but what struck the president most was the man's restraint. Even after 7 years of abandonment, Emmanuel's pain had not turned into rage. It had settled into something far more devastating: acceptance. Traoré turned sharply to the warden, who had been standing awkwardly in the shadows. "Bring me this man's file. Every document. Every record of his trial, investigation, everything." "Sir, that could take some time. You have until sunset," the president cut him off. His tone was cold steel. "I want to know who the arresting officers were, who the judge was, why this man is sitting here after 7 years without a single visitor." The warden scurried away, knowing the president's words were not requests, they were commands. Returning his gaze to Emmanuel, Traoré asked quietly, "Why didn't you appeal?" Surely there were options. A bitter laugh escaped Emmanuel's lips, not angry, just hollow. "With what money, sir?" "My wife left me in the first year, took our children, and went back to her village. She said she couldn't bear the shame. I had no money for appeals, no connections, no voice anyone cared to hear." The president's chest tightened as he listened. This wasn't just Emmanuel's story. This was the silent scream of thousands trapped in a system that punished the voiceless while shielding the powerful. "Have you had any visitors in these 7 years?" Traoré asked. "No one," Emmanuel said, his voice barely a whisper. "I wrote letters for the first 2 years, but no one wrote back. They were never answered," Emmanuel said softly. "Eventually I stopped trying. I learned to find peace in solitude." That evening, President Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in his office at the Ministry of Justice, a heavy file spread across his desk. But this wasn't just paperwork. This was a man's life laid bare: 7 years of injustice, betrayal, and silence. The deeper he read, the more his blood began to boil. Emmanuel's case was not an unfortunate error. It was a calculated crime, a textbook example of judicial corruption and systemic failure. The investigation had been nothing more than a formality. The evidence, circumstantial, fragile, almost laughable. The trial had lasted less than 2 hours. But the most damning discovery of all was the judge, Justice Amadou Diabra. The very man who had sentenced Emmanuel to 15 years had been dismissed from office 3 years ago for bribery. The man who passed judgment on Emmanuel was, in fact, a criminal himself. President Traoré's hand trembled as he reached for his phone. "Defame," he said, his voice low, controlled, dangerous. "I need you here immediately. Cancel everything." Within the hour, Justice Minister Defame stood in the president's office. watching his leader pace behind his desk like a storm trapped in a room. "Sir, you called for me urgently?" "I visited the central prison today," Traoré began. "No time for formalities?" "I met a man named Emmanuel. He's been rotting in a cell for 7 years for a crime he didn't commit." He handed the minister the thick file. "Read this. All of it. And tell me how this happened." As Defame flipped through the documents, his face lost color. Every page was a dagger-fabricated evidence, a sham trial, a corrupt judge who had destroyed a man's life with a stroke of his pen. "Sir, this is a disaster," Defame stammered. "But the conviction stands. Legally, we cannot." The president's voice sliced through the room like a blade. "Cannot seek justice? Cannot admit when? We've caged an innocent man for 7 years. What is it we cannot do, Minister?" Defame fell silent. There was no argument, not against this man. "Here's what we will do," Traoré said, his tone ironclad. "Tomorrow, you will assemble an independent review team. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, human rights observers, everyone. They will tear this case apart, piece by piece. Laurent Gorgui will be investigated thoroughly. If he framed Emmanuel, I guarantee he's done it before." Over the next 48 hours, the review team worked relentlessly. What they uncovered was horrifying. Laurent Gorgui's company had accused at least 5 other employees of theft over the past decade. Every accused was poor, voiceless, and systematically discarded by the courts. Each trial had been a sham quick convictions. No legal defense, fabricated evidence. In Emmanuel's case, a handwriting expert confirmed his confession had been forged, financial records manipulated. Entire case had been built on lies. When the findings were presented to President Traoré, his face showed no satisfaction, only grim determination. "We will not only free him," the president said, his voice resonating with authority. "We will expose every hand that played a role in this. Justice will be done. And we will ensure this never happens again in Burkina Faso." The next morning, the redemption this time, when President Traoré returned to Ouagadougou Central Prison, he wasn't alone. Media cameras followed. Reporters jostled for space. Legal teams marched with purpose. The eyes of the nation were about to witness history, a president personally correcting a system's failure. As the convoy arrived, anticipation rippled through the prison walls. Guards stood straighter. Inmates whispered. Word had spread. Something extraordinary was about to happen. But in his dark, cold cell, Emmanuel sat unaware of the commotion. 7 years of disappointment had taught him not to hope. The clang of approaching footsteps echoed louder than usual. Then, silence. "Emmanuel," a familiar voice called. He looked up slowly, standing before his cell, surrounded by cameras. And legal officials was President Traoré. "Emmanuel," Traoré said, unlocking the cell with his own hands, "you're going home." For a heartbeat, Emmanuel didn't move. Disbelief routed him to the spot. But as the reality settled in, his legs trembled as he stood. Tears blurred his vision. The cell door creaked open, not just for Emmanuel, but for justice itself. As he stepped out, the prison courtyard erupted in quiet applause, not for show, but for a man who had endured, and for a leader who had finally listened. That day, the story of Emmanuel's freedom was not just a headline. It became a symbol of a nation reclaiming its conscience. For 7 long years, Emmanuel had taught himself not to believe in miracles. When he heard footsteps approaching his cell that morning, he barely glanced up. Another inspection, another day of nothing. But then a voice that had echoed in his thoughts for the last 3 days. "Emmanuel." He looked up. For a heartbeat, his mind refused to believe what his eyes were seeing. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before his cell, not alone, but flanked by legal officials. Cameras and faces that radiated purpose. The prison block fell into a deep, reverent silence. Inmates pressed against their cell bars. Guards froze in place. Everyone knew this was not a routine visit. This was a moment that would be remembered. "Emmanuel," the president spoke, his voice steady yet heavy with regret. "I've read your file. You weren't just wrongly accused. You were betrayed by a system that was supposed to protect you. Every camera captured the weight of those words. Every prisoner held their breath, watching history unfold before their eyes. "Sorry," Traoré continued. "Our nation failed you. Our courts failed you. But today, we start to make it right." He turned to his legal team and then back to Emmanuel. "Emmanuel, you are going home today." For a moment, Emmanuel couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "Going home," he whispered, as if the very concept was foreign. His hands gripped the cold iron bars to steady himself. Tears, long held back, began to fall freely. "Yes," the president said, his voice firm. "You are a free man." The cell door swung open slowly, deliberately. It wasn't just a door opening. It was a nation's conscience unlocking itself. Dunged as Emmanuel stepped out into the corridor. His legs trembled, but as he stood tall, a roar of applause erupted from the other prisoners. Cheers, whistles, fists raised in the air. Men who had long given up hope wept openly, seeing Emmanuel's freedom as a crack of light in the darkness of their own fates. Outside the prison gates, a large crowd had gathered. News of the president's unprecedented intervention had spread. Like wildfire through Ouagadougou, when Emmanuel emerged, squinting into the sunlight after years of dim fluorescent lights. The crowd greeted him with a thunderous ovation. Reporters surged forward. "How do you feel? What will you do? Now. Do you feel anger towards those who wronged you?" Emmanuel paused. Overwhelmed by the noise, the attention, the freedom itself. I don't know how to feel," he admitted, his voice quiet yet piercing. "I have no family, no home, no job, but for the first time in 7 years, I have hope. And maybe that's enough to start with." President Traoré placed a firm hand on Emmanuel's shoulder. "You are not alone," he said, his voice strong, rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "Our nation owes you a debt that can never truly be repaid, but we will do everything we can to help you rebuild your life." True to his word, the president personally drove Emmanuel to the presidential guest house. For Emmanuel, the simple luxuries, a hot shower, clean clothes, a warm meal at a proper table, felt surreal. Each small comfort was a reminder that his life was beginning again. That evening, in the quiet of a sitting room filled with soft lamplight, President Traoré and Emmanuel sat across from one another. 2 cups of tea sat between them, not as president and citizen, but as 2 men connected by justice, pain, and hope. "Tell me," Traoré said softly, before all of this happened. "What were your dreams, Emmanuel?" For the first time in years, a genuine smile formed on Emmanuel's face. "I wanted to be a teacher. I studied education before I took the job with Guru's company. I always dreamed of helping children learn, giving them the tools to build a better life." The president nodded, a smile touching his lips. "Then that's exactly what you'll do. We'll arrange for you to complete your education," President Ibrahim Traoré said, his tone decisive, unwavering. "And when you're ready, you'll have a position within our school system." But even as he spoke, a bigger vision was already taking root in his mind. Over the following days, as Emmanuel adjusted to the strange, liberating rhythm of freedom, President Traoré was quietly orchestrating something unprecedented: a national audit of Burkina Faso's entire prison system. "If this happened to Emmanuel," he told his cabinet, "how many others are suffering the same silent injustice? How many innocent people are rotting in our prisons while we congratulate ourselves on law and order?" The cabinet meeting was tense. Several ministers exchanged nervous glances, voicing fears of what such a sweeping investigation might uncover. What if we find hundreds of wrongful convictions? What if the public loses faith in the justice system itself? "And we fix it," Traoré replied, his tone as sharp as a blade. "All of it, no matter how painful, no matter how embarrassing, no matter how expensive. Justice delayed is justice denied, damned. We've denied it for far too long." Within a week, the president announced to the nation the launch of Operation Justice Light, a nationwide review of every prisoner who had served more than 5 years, with a special focus on cases where individuals had lacked legal representation. But this was more than a policy announcement. Emmanuel would not just be a beneficiary of this movement, he would become its symbol, and soon, one of its leaders. 3 months later, a new voice for justice. 3 months after his liberation, Emmanuel stood on the stage of a packed auditorium at the University of Ouagadougou. He wore a crisp white shirt, a dark jacket, and carried himself with a quiet authority that silenced the crowd even before he spoke. Gone was the broken man who had emerged from prison. What stood now was a man reborn, fueled by purpose, his voice steady and strong. "I speak to you today not as a victim," he began, his words ringing clear across the silent hall, "but as a witness to what happens when power operates without accountability, and as living proof of what becomes possible when leaders choose courage over convenience." In the front row, President Traoré watched with pride. This was Emmanuel's idea. Sharing his story with law students would one day shape the future of Burkina Faso's justice system. Operation Justice Light had not only lived up to its promise, it exceeded every expectation. In 6 months, the review teams had re-examined over 2,000 cases. The result: 347 prisoners identified as wrongfully convicted or held beyond their legal sentences. Each case carried with it a trail of shattered families, lost futures, and human dignity trampled under the weight of a broken system. But perhaps the most explosive discovery was the network of corruption tied to Laurent Gouer and other influential businessmen. A vast conspiracy of fabricated accusations, bought judges, falsified evidence, and silenced witnesses. Gouer, once untouchable, now sat in the same prison where Emmanuel had languished for 7 years. This time the roles were reversed. The irony was not lost on anyone. But Emmanuel's visit to his former employer defied expectations. Standing outside the prison bars, he delivered a message not of vengeance, but of forgiveness. "Justice is not revenge," Emmanuel told Gouer, his words cutting deeper than any sentence. "It's the hope that others won't suffer as we both have, you in your greed, and me in my innocence." Even Gouer, hardened by years of corruption, had been moved to tears. President Traoré, deeply touched by Emmanuel's grace, took an unprecedented step. He appointed Emmanuel as special advisor on prison reform and human rights, a position that had never existed before, but one that quickly became essential to the nation's transformation. Emmanuel's journey from prisoner to policymaker became a symbol not only of personal redemption, but of a nation's reckoning with its own failures. The transformation was no longer just Emmanuel's story. It had become Burkina Faso's story, a testament that true justice is not measured by punishment, but by the courage to admit when we've been wrong and the resolve to make it right. Emmanuel's work would take him far beyond the walls of his own former prison. From the largest correctional facilities in the heart of Burkina Faso's cities too small, forgotten rural jails that had operated without oversight for decades, Emmanuel was relentless. But it wasn't just his government title that opened doors. It was the weight of his story, the undeniable credibility of a man who had lived the nightmare of wrongful imprisonment. In the northern town of Dori, he found a man who had been forgotten in a cell for 12 years without trial. In Bobo Dioulasso, he discovered 3 women imprisoned for so-called economic crimes, which investigations revealed to be nothing more than acts of poverty. Each case hardened Emmanuel's resolve. Each injustice deepened his understanding of how indifference, more than malice, could corrupt a system meant to protect. But Emmanuel's greatest contribution wasn't just liberating the wrongfully convicted. It was his unwavering insistence that true justice requires more than unlocking cell doors. He fought for comprehensive support systems, job training, psychological counseling, family reunification services, legal aid programs. "Freedom is not just opening a cell door," he told a gathering of international human rights observers. "It's ensuring that people have the tools to build meaningful lives, and it's rebuilding the system that failed them to serve justice, not power." President Traoré embraced this vision fully. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso became a beacon of judicial reform in West Africa. Legal aid clinics were established in every region. Mandatory training for judges and prosecutors was implemented, or an independent prison oversight board was created with Emmanuel as its inaugural chair. But reform came at a political cost. Powerful figures, those who had thrived under the old system, began to push back. They called the president naive, They accused Emmanuel of being vindictive, but the people stood firm. Public support remained unwavering, especially as families were reunited. And each new case of justice restored became a symbol of hope. 1 year later, full circle, exactly 1 year after his liberation, Emmanuel returned to Ouagadougou's central prison. But this time, the occasion was not sorrowful. The prison had been transformed. Living conditions had been humanized. Educational programs were in place. Legal aid offices operated inside the facility itself. But the most symbolic change was a plaque that now hung above the entrance. Justice delayed is justice denied. Never again. Standing before a crowd of officials, former prisoners, and families, Emmanuel took the stage. A year ago he began, "I sat in a cell, believing the world had forgotten me. I was wrong. The world hadn't forgotten. It simply wasn't listening. Today, we stand together, not just to celebrate my freedom, but our collective commitment to ensuring that every voice is heard, every case is fairly judged, and every person is treated with dignity." President Traoré followed, but his words were few. Sometimes, he said, "A leader's greatest achievement is knowing when to follow." Emmanuel has taught our nation more about justice than any law book ever could. The work continues, but the foundation is strong. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, Emmanuel lingered. He stood in front of his former cell, now converted into a small library. Through the barred window, the afternoon sunlight danced across shelves filled with books on law, human rights, and social justice. Tools for future generations to build a more just society. As he walked away from the prison, this time for the final time, Emmanuel carried no bitterness for the years he had lost. Instead, he carried hope for the lives that would be saved by the changes he and so many others had fought to create. Justice, Emmanuel had learned, is not a destination. It's a journey, one that demands constant vigilance, courage, and the willingness to listen to voices the world might otherwise ignore. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Burkina Faso continued its own journey toward a more just tomorrow.